For 3 days in May 1991, Washington, D.C. experienced some of the worst rioting in its history. In Mount Pleasant, Columbia Heights, and Adams Morgan, thousands of discontented Salvadoran immigrants took to the streets after the killing of an unarmed civilian by police. In this video, we'll walk down the long and winding path of history to see how a civil war in El Salvador triggered a riot in the capital. Our story begins in the late 1960s with the civil rights movement for racial equality. Led by activists like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, a series of marches and boycotts had pressured the U.S. government into enacting sweeping legal reforms. Few cities benefited more from the change than Washington, D.C. Known as Chocolate City, the capital had a sizable black population that traced its roots back many generations. The progress of the 1960s seemed to suggest that the 1970s and 80s would be a golden age for DC's black community. But there was another minority population, growing in size and struggling to define its own place in post-civil rights Washington: Salvadoran immigrants.
El Salvador is the smallest of the Central American republics, but it is a giant among them in industrial activity.
El Salvador is only about the size of New Jersey, but it is a country whose fate has been inextricably tied to U.S. interests. As one of North America's top coffee producers, El Salvador's economy relies heavily on exports to the United States. The blessings of doing business with the U.S. didn't accrue to all classes of society, however. Coffee profits largely filled the pockets of the wealthy landowning class, which comprised only about 4% of the population.
Soil is the foundation of happiness, prosperity, and progress. Deeply rooted in the earth is the welfare of all people.
El Salvador's peasant class, the agricultural workers, traditionally labored as serfs on land that they controlled themselves. But the advent of a wage-based system in El Salvador had little success, and as El Salvador's economy grew, the peasants remained impoverished.
Trabajar. In Spanish, it means to work. And to the majority of people in El Salvador, to work means to work the land. It is agriculture which is the backbone of the Salvadoran economy, which provides roughly 1/4 of the gross national product, generates 90% of the foreign trade, and employs 60% of the labor force. Most of the people who make up that labor force live in grinding poverty, struggling to exist on an average wage of between $2 and $3 a day.
U.S. policy was to support the regime in power and keep the oppressed peasant class from revolting. But the United States tends not to like allying itself with military dictatorships. So elections were regularly conducted to create the outward appearance of democracy. Presidents were elected every 4 years, but the candidates were handpicked by the ruling class. In the 1970s, a seemingly unrelated event in the Middle East had ripples which rocked the U.S.-dependent Salvadoran economy.
Good evening. The Middle East war produced developments all over the world today. The oil-producing countries of the Arab world decided they will reduce oil production by 5% a month until the Israelis withdraw from occupied territories. If the Arab countries keep that pledge, it would reduce their production by almost 50% in 1 year.
An oil embargo, imposed on the United States by a coalition of Arab countries, had caused a massive spike in gas prices. Americans were buying less of everything, including coffee. Exports, the backbone of the Salvadoran economy, plummeted. And in the long recession that followed, discontent and desperation among the rural poor fueled calls for a change in government. Protests were met with the harshest crackdowns. but the situation grew so dire that even the toughest repressions failed to stop the resistance. Peaceful protests eventually turned to violent clashes. In 1979, Americans were stunned when a group of American nuns were murdered by government forces under suspicion of colluding with communists. President Jimmy Carter, under heavy public pressure, approved a CIA plan to overthrow the president of El Salvador in a military coup. The coup was executed bloodlessly, but a provisional government was formed which was little more than a military junta, eager to crack down on dissent. Peasant leaders and workers' organizations responded by demanding major agrarian reforms to break up and redistribute the coffee producers' land. Some Social Democrats tried to work with the junta and steer its leaders toward progressive reforms.
Next to the Colonels Gutierrez and Majano, 3 progressive politicians joined the junta, among them Guillermo Ungo.
In this period of Genesis, which will give new life to our society and especially to the masses.
The hardliners within the military soon took over. Reforms failed to materialize, and Ungo quit on January the 2nd, 1980. One of the ex-ministers went a step further and joined the guerrillas.
My joining the Liberation Front causes a great deal of risk, and it becomes now that I'm forced to go underground.
On January 10th, 1980, a massive protest was assembled in the nation's capital of San Salvador to call for an end to military rule. It was met with extreme violence. Carter's coup had unleashed forces long held dormant under the oppressive thumb of a violent status quo. Many miles to the north, the same stagnant economy that had destabilized El Salvador was plaguing the United States. High unemployment, high inflation, and long gas lines spread discontent everywhere, and most of it converged on President Jimmy Carter.
Isn't this disgusting? Why doesn't anybody contact the president? Why is he letting this happen to us?
Carter is often seen as a charitable figure today, but during his time in office, there wasn't much charity to go around. Budget cuts, austerity, and economic shock treatments did little to fix the immediate situation and only exacerbated displeasure with the administration.
And I'm asking you to take no unnecessary trips, to use carpools or public transportation whenever you can, to park your car 1 extra day per week, to obey the speed limit, and to set your thermostats to save fuel.
Primary season for the GOP was hotly contested in 1980. The frontrunner, former California Governor Ronald Reagan, was a longtime hero of the party's right wing. But by 1980, Reagan was in his late 60s, and some in the party began looking for younger options. George Herbert Walker Bush was in his mid-50s, but he was the picture of health. Bush had plenty working against him, too. Unlike Reagan, the son of immigrants who had a rags-to-riches story, Bush was a paragon of privilege. His father, Prescott Bush, was one of the wealthiest people in the Senate, a moderate with a diplomatic air. Additionally, Bush had held only one elected position in his entire career. Most of Bush's resume was comprised of political appointments: director of CIA, chairman of the RNC. It left Bush with the stench of a Washington insider, and his 2 years as ambassador to China and his close relationship with Chinese Premier Deng Xiaoping didn't speak well for his anti-communist credentials. Bush was a World War II fighter pilot, once shot down over the Pacific. And yet, he would be seen as a wimp compared to Ronald Reagan, who only played soldiers in movies. Bush lost the primary to Reagan, but the very moderation which cost him the nomination was exactly what Reagan needed to balance the ticket and win voters in the center. Reagan picked Bush to run as his vice president, and Bush agreed. Reagan-Bush soundly defeated President Carter, taking office in January 1981. Ronald Reagan was willing to bear any burden and support any friend, oppose any foe, in his struggle to rid the world of communism. Toward the end of his second term, pro-democracy protests spread across Eastern Europe. Reagan's vocal support of anti-communist movements around the world would earn him the public image of a champion of liberty. Nations like Poland and Lithuania became shining examples of the yearning of Eastern Europe to break away from the Soviet Union and open the floodgates of free market capitalism. Reagan's idealism would bear fruit in his Soviet policy, but in Central America, it would see some of his greatest calamities.
What we see in El Salvador is an attempt to destabilize the entire region and eventually move chaos and anarchy toward the American border. This communist subversion poses the threat that 100 million people from Panama to the open border of our South could come under the control of pro-Soviet regimes.
Reagan believed that both Cuba and the Soviet Union were using Central American countries like El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala as a staging ground to infiltrate the United States and its interests in the Western Hemisphere. At one press conference, he even falsely claimed a Soviet ship carrying weapons was on its way to Nicaragua. Over the 8 years he was president, Reagan fully committed his country to completely annihilating the communist element in the region.
We can and must help Central America. It's in our national interest to do so, and morally, it's the only right thing to do. We Americans should be proud of what we're trying to do in Central America. Let us show the world that we want no hostile communist colonies here in the Americas, South, Central, or North.
Salvadorians, our country is in jeopardy. Communism threatens our freedom. If we don't act now, tomorrow we will be slaves.
It didn't take long for the military junta in El Salvador to realize the advantage of singing the Pied Piper song for President Reagan. Anti-communism saturated the pro-military propaganda of the time, leading to a spirit of paranoia. Anyone from students speaking out against the atrocities of the government to union members striking for decent wages became communist partisans and terrorists in the eyes of the junta.
And I went to drink some lemonade, and then I heard shots. They grabbed me. I got scared and ran, that's all.
Documentarians caught up with this group of farmers striking for higher wages.
Do you want $2? Do you want $2.50? Do you want $3.50? Do you want $4.50? I expect money, but a few animals have already died. What good is money if my animals die? The cows must be milked.
Only a few minutes later, the rural police called in by the owner ended the rally. The campaign for higher wages ended in the morgue.
Violence in Central America, supported by millions of U.S. taxpayer dollars, forced people to leave Nicaragua, Guatemala, and El Salvador in ever-increasing numbers. Most fled north through Mexico, where they faced a long trek through unfriendly lands. Refugees often continued until they arrived at the U.S. border, where gangs of kidnappers, often in league with the police, awaited them. The desperate situation in Mexico would force many immigrants to illegally cross the border into the United States. The trip was extremely dangerous. Many drowned in the fast, unpredictable rivers. Others froze or dehydrated in harsh deserts. But making it to the U.S. was not the end of their troubles. Refugees found themselves in an unfriendly country without documentation. Many hunkered down in border towns, sleeping under bridges and resorting to petty crimes just to feed their families. This created anger among the local townspeople, who demanded the government address the thousands of unhoused and desperate people living in their towns. The Reagan administration instituted a general policy of sweeping these refugees under the rug. They were huddled into cramped immigration prisons, where they would await their claims for asylum in appalling conditions. Those who were brought before judges were often deported on grounds that they were in league with the communists, usually with no evidence presented. For most of them, deportation back home amounted to a death sentence. Since the 1940s, there had been a small community of Salvadorans, also political refugees, who had carved out a small niche in D.C.'s growing urban sprawl. By the 1960s, just under 100,000 Salvadorans lived in the U.S. capital city. Once the Civil War had broken out, many thousands more began to arrive. Washington offered community support, as well as an arsenal of immigration attorneys. Undocumented people often found jobs as dishwashers and nannies. By the end of the 1970s, the Salvadoran population in D.C. had ballooned to 600,000. Salvadoran neighborhoods were taking shape in D.C.'s northwest regions of Mount Pleasant, Columbia Heights, and Adams Morgan. Mayor Marion Barry even nicknamed Adams Morgan the Latin Quarter. Still, most Salvadorans migrating to Washington struggled to gain respect in their new home. No benefits, lower wages, longer hours, and always the threat of deportation hanging over their heads. Desperate to improve their situation, Salvadorans tried organizing politically, but found themselves at odds with a new establishment of black politicians. By comparison to the Salvadorans, DC's black community could trace its roots much further back into the city's history. And with government budgets shrinking every year to meet the economic crisis, a growing nativism emerged within the black community. During one speech in which DC Mayor Marion Barry advocated for assistance to the Salvadoran community, he incurred the ire of his constituents.
How in the world are you going to do so much for so many immigrants when you have people already over here who don't have nothing?
Meanwhile, President Reagan's Central American policy was beginning to unravel. El Salvador's neighbor, Nicaragua, was also in the grips of a right-wing terror regime funded by the United States, known as the Contras. The Reagan administration had devised a rather complex scheme whereby weapons were sold to the revolutionary government of Iran in exchange for the release of American hostages held by Iranian-backed terrorists in Lebanon. The money made off weapons sales was then discreetly funneled to the Nicaraguan government. This was done to sidestep a recent congressional prohibition on sending money to the Contras. The scheme was revealed by left-wing journalists in 1986. What became known as the Iran-Contra affair proved to be the worst scandal of the Reagan presidency. As public opinion turned against Reagan's Nicaragua policy, the well of support for the Contra regime dried up, and it soon collapsed. Now the very people who'd been persecuting the peasant and working classes of Nicaragua were following in their footsteps, escaping their homeland, traveling through Mexico, and crossing into the U.S. at the southern border. On July 7, 1987, Attorney General Edwin Meese ordered Immigration and Naturalization Services to stop all deportations of Nicaraguan refugees. The reprieve coincided perfectly with the fall of the Nicaraguan regime and the mass exodus of Contras and other Nicaraguans who aided the U.S. and the death squads. Preferential treatment for the Contras led to even more denunciations of the Reagan administration, and demands were soon heard to extend the same rights to refugees fleeing violence in Guatemala and El Salvador. As Reagan's term came to an end, many wondered, what policy would Reagan's successor embrace? George Herbert Walker Bush, the Vice President of the United States, stepped confidently into the election of 1988. He had a lot to feel confident about. The economy began picking up in the final years of the Reagan presidency. Reagan had become a megastar on the world stage, with a high approval rating at home, and much of this praise trickled down to Bush.
All in all, not bad. Not bad at all.
But the stain of Iran-Contra had not yet lifted, and Bush would face tough questions on the campaign trail.
1/4 of the people who say that, they rather like you, believe you're hiding something. Now, if you are, here's a chance to get it out.
You know what I'm hiding? What I told the president. That's the only thing. And it's been confirmed that I had reservations and spoke up by Don Regan. In fact, he said the other day that I expressed them to the president.
That's correct.
I don't discuss what I talked to the president because there's a principle involved. Nothing to do with Iran-Contra. It's the principle of confidentiality between the president and the vice president.
Mr. Vice President.
How deeply involved Bush was in the Iran-Contra affair has long remained a mystery. He attended many of the meetings where these issues were discussed, and his talent for keeping secrets was a big reason Reagan had picked him for vice president. Whatever the case, Bush proved adept at ducking any charges that he knew anything about Iran-Contra. 5 weeks before the 1988 election, the Reagan administration attempted to further soften Bush's image by announcing that all Guatemalan and Salvadoran refugees would be granted temporary asylum and the right to work and travel in the United States. Vice President Bush coasted to a decisive election victory. Less than a month after his election, the policy was reversed. The George H.W. Bush, who climbed the Capitol steps to take his oath as America's 41st president, seemed a much different man than the one Americans had seen on the campaign. The longtime political appointee, loyal vice president, and child of privilege, seemed eager not only to break with the harsh tone of the election season, but with the dogmatic tone of the prior administration. From the start of his term, it became apparent that President Bush was a pragmatist, more concerned with world stability than with fighting evil. When thousands of demonstrators were beaten and killed on Tiananmen Square in Beijing, Bush resisted efforts from the Congress to impose massive sanctions. As the Berlin Wall came down in East Germany, Bush refused to give a triumphal speech. Instead, he discussed his excitements and trepidations candidly with reporters from the Oval Office.
Is this the end of the Iron Curtain, sir?
Well, I don't think any single event is the end of what you might call the Iron Curtain.
You don't seem elated, and I'm wondering if you're thinking of the problems.
I'm not an emotional kind of guy.
Well, how elated are you?
I'm very pleased. And I've been very pleased with a lot of other developments.
The same diplomatic spirit that guided the Bush administration during the unraveling of the Soviet Union caused a change in policy towards Central America as well. In 1990, Bush sent the military into Panama to remove a dictator and drug trafficker named Manuel Noriega. The U.S. had long relied on Noriega for support in its war on communism. Bush himself had kept Noriega on the CIA payroll when he was director. But now he was sending a message that anti-communism would no longer get you a free pass. El Salvador's new president, Alfredo Cristiani, campaigned on a peaceful resolution to the conflict and expressed willingness to meet with opposition groups. Bush called for an international peacekeeping organization, including the UN, to help negotiate a settlement. Violence continued into the fall of 1990. In November, the main partisan group, the FMLN, launched a failed offensive, attempting to overthrow the government. That same month, death squads killed 4 priests, a housekeeper, and her daughter. Outrage over the incident spread around the globe, and President Bush was soon confronted by protesters.
Why are we killing priests in El Salvador?
The answer is we're not. Now you be quiet. President Cristiani is trying to do a job for democracy, and the left-wing guerrillas must not take over El Salvador.
Bush maintained his support for the Salvadoran government, but pressured President Cristiani to get to the bottom of these horrific killings. Democrats denounced Bush, passing resolutions condemning the Salvadoran regime and threatening to cut aid and impose sanctions. This would have amounted to little more than raising a stink in Reagan's day, but President Bush proved much more flexible and willing to work with Congress. Bush even used the resolutions passed by the Democrat-controlled House and Senate as a card in negotiations with the Salvadorans. As the negotiations progressed, pressure continued for Bush to address the hundreds of thousands of undocumented Salvadorans in the capital. In 1990, he authorized a stop to deportations of Central American refugees and granted hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans temporary protective status. Many of Washington, D.C.'s Salvadorans were overjoyed, but as the struggle for sanctuary gained a victory, the struggle for status in America continued. Although President Bush took office at a time of relative prosperity, the economy took a turn for the worse in 1990, and a brief recession ensued. The crash had rippling effects across the nation, creating desperation in all of America's cities. Crime rates skyrocketed, and divisions and tensions were exacerbated by the economic doldrums. President Bush's tough-on-crime programs and aggressive prosecution of the war on drugs was putting more cops on the street, including in Mount Pleasant, Columbia Heights, and Adams Morgan. Almost none of the officers assigned to Salvadoran neighborhoods spoke Spanish, and Mayor Barry's office ignored complaints from Salvadoran advocacy groups to allow community policing. Relations between police and the Salvadoran community took on an ever more antagonistic tone. Tensions were poised to spill into an open conflict. In the spring of 1991, as the Cinco de Mayo holiday approached, D.C.'s Salvadorans were enjoying festivities. According to official reports, some police officers came upon a group of intoxicated festival-goers in the park and attempted to arrest one of them, a man named Daniel Enrique Gomez. Witnesses disagree on exactly what happened next, but after a brief scuffle, a black female officer fired shots. Moments later, Gomez lay dying from a bullet wound to the chest, his hands above his head in handcuffs. It took little time for crowds to begin gathering to demand an explanation. The police insisted Gomez had a knife. The crowd said Gomez was already in handcuffs when he was shot. Anger turned to chants that Gomez was murdered. Chants turned into pushing and shoving, and eventually more members of the community began stepping into the streets. They rioted all night and into the morning, injuring several police officers and lighting some cars on fire. When a vicious rainstorm suddenly swept through the neighborhood, round one of the Mount Pleasant riots was over. Community leaders scrambled to make sense of the previous day's events. Mayor Sharon Pratt, who had taken over from Marion Barry only days earlier, took a tour of Ground Zero. Burnt-out cars and broken glass shards dotted the landscape. As Pratt toured the devastation, locals, including many business owners, pleaded with Mayor Pratt to do more than just put down the violence. Decades of complaints about discrimination and ill treatment of D.C.'s Hispanic community poured out. Although local news focused its attention on the events of May 5th, national media was dominated by a completely different story.
Good evening. President Bush remains hospitalized at Bethesda Naval Hospital tonight. At last word, the president does still suffer from an irregular heartbeat.
President Bush usually limits his actual jogging time to 22 minutes. Yesterday, he had been running and walking for 35 to 40 minutes when he had trouble breathing.
The media went into full gear, with charts and experts trying to keep tabs on the president's condition. Bush tried to reassure reporters from the window of his hospital room at Walter Reed. Puff pieces tried to distill any potential panic over the president's condition.
An official photograph released by the White House showed the Bush grandchildren presenting him with a Nintendo Game Boy, the handheld video game.
Although Bush tried to project an image of vitality before the cameras, his doctors had decided to keep him in hospital overnight. The news caused distress among the public, not so much over the possible death of a president, but over who would replace him. Vice President Dan Quayle had been the butt of many jokes since his rise to the vice presidency.
Thank you. Potato, how's it? You write phonetically. What else? There you go.
All across the media, think pieces were published asking, what if Dan Quayle became president? It was part humor, part dread that fueled the public fascination.
the next vice president.
The question of Quayle's competency to succeed George Bush has been an issue ever since the president selected the junior senator from Indiana to be his running mate. A poll taken last week showed that only 19% of the American people believe Quayle is qualified to be president.
While national media was distracted, local media coverage was dominated by news of the events of May 5th. Word was getting out across town, and soon protesters from other neighborhoods began bussing into Mount Pleasant. For the rest of the night, D.C. police stood by, watching as hundreds of rioters looted, burned cars, broke store windows, and laid waste to dozens of businesses. By now, rioting had spread into Adams Morgan and Mount Pleasant as well. Salvadorans often employed the same tactics they'd learned escaping the death squads back home, including guerrilla attacks on riot police. On May 7th, Mayor Pratt declared a state of emergency in Washington and instituted curfews in all 3 neighborhoods. The threat of arrest now looming, the riots began to recede, although scattered violence occurred in pockets of the city. The violence had ended. The Salvadorans had been heard. But would anything change? President Bush's heart was still beating irregularly when he was discharged from the hospital and returned to work. As he returned to the White House, reporters asked him about his health and his thoughts on Dan Quayle stepping into the presidency.
What do you think about all the talk of the competence of Vice President Quayle if this is revived?
He has my full support, always has, and he's doing a first-class job.
Still, the scare had provided a wedge issue for Democrats. Bush maintained a busy schedule that day, meeting with a Minnesota senator, the Russian ex-foreign minister, and the president of Cameroon. By 5:30, the drugs had finally stabilized President Bush's heartbeat. Reporters continued to press the president and his circle for more information, but the health scare was brushed off as a minor blip in an otherwise healthy man. Doctors would later diagnose the president with a thyroid condition known as Graves' disease. President Bush continued his efforts at pressuring both sides of the Salvadoran Civil War to agree on a ceasefire, but he was anxious to let other organizations join in the discussions. Bush believed the UN would have a much greater role to play in a post-Cold War world. Besides, handing the problem off to the UN meant Bush had one less thing to worry about. With the help of other countries like Costa Rica, Peru, and Mexico, as well as the Catholic Church, negotiations gradually moved in a positive direction. In 1992, the Chapultepec Accords were signed in Mexico City, officially bringing an end to the multi-decade civil war. By that time, many of the Salvadorans who had escaped the war no longer considered themselves refugees. They had sacrificed, worked, and bled for their community in Washington, D.C. This was their new home. The Mount Pleasant riots was the largest conflagration of violence in Washington, D.C. since the 1968 riots that followed the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. These little-known events not only help us understand a very critical time in U.S. history, but they reveal something about the times we live in now. The U.S. is the center of a vast global network of commerce, and when the economy hits a snag, as it has since the emergence of COVID-19, everyone in the network feels it. Whether its ripples cause revolutions in Central America, or its waves wash away union jobs here in the United States, discontent feeds the anger, hunger feeds the rage. The crunch is felt on every street corner and in every neighborhood, and those who find themselves on the bottom rungs of society feel it the hardest. Hope dissolves, and people lash out. Whether riots are justifiable or even effective means of solving political differences, I can't really say. Perhaps you can share your thoughts in the comments below. One thing is for sure. They are a universal fact of history, a fact with which all societies must contend, and a fact which challenges us to embrace a broader view of our history and our future.